Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris McCallion. I'm a fellow here at Defense Priorities, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel that we've organized with an all-star roster of experts to talk about the recent NATO summit. We've decided to call this panel A Bridge to NATO or False Hope for Ukraine. And we'll be talking about obviously the recent NATO summit, the U.S. role in the alliance, the Europeans' role in the alliance, and what relationship the alliance has with Ukraine and maybe even the Indo-Pacific. So first off, we have Dr. Kelly Gresko, who is a senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center, where her work focuses on U.S. foreign policy and defense, addressing questions about international security, force structure, military alliances, drone warfare, air power, and the future of war. She has expertise in U.S. military alliances and the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific and Europe, which we'll be talking about today, as well as current and emerging air power strategies and capabilities. Her latest article in Foreign Affairs, published this week, argues against NATO increasing its involvement in Indo-Pacific security. Welcome, Kelly. Next up, we have Dr. Stephen Wertheim, who is a senior fellow in the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is a historian of U.S. foreign policy and analyzes contemporary problems in American strategy and diplomacy. Stephen is also a visiting lecturer at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. He is the author of a very well-regarded book called Tomorrow, the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, which is about U.S. grand strategy over the post-war period and before, to some extent as well. And last but not least, we have Dr. William Ruger, who is the president of the American Institute for Economic Research. Will's scholarship has appeared in a number of academic journals, and his most recent work examines the relationship between military service, combat experience, and civic participation. Will is a veteran of the Afghanistan War and was awarded the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, among other decorations. He remains an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve. Will was nominated to serve as U.S. ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and was a longtime prominent advocate for ending America's participation in the war there. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Our pleasure. So to start off, I was in New York this week, so I was not in Washington, and I didn't have to suffer the traffic obstructions and everything. But during the summit, there was a lot of pomp and backslapping, and Jens Stoltenberg got his jersey retired to the rafters and some other stuff. But I'm wondering what substantially came out of the summit, if anything, and what your take is on the most significant thing to come out of the summit. Let's start off with you, Kelly.
Great. Well, first, thank you to Defense Priorities for hosting this event. It's nice to have the opportunity to sort of do a debrief after this week's event. So the question you asked about what's the most significant issue, I mean, I think it's clear that the summit was dominated by two issues, Biden's health and Ukraine. And on the Ukraine issue, a lot has been made of the fact of, this inclusion of language talking about in the communique that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to membership in the alliance. And I would just note that I think there's been a lot of focus on the semantics and in the inclusion of that word. But what we actually see is that the policy hasn't really changed in the position of NATO, and that there's no sign that Ukraine is any closer to actually joining NATO. And in fact, I think it's pretty clear that there's no intention for Ukraine to join NATO, certainly while the war is ongoing. And if anything, I think the inclusion of that language suggests that Ukraine's going to be kept in the waiting room, perhaps permanently, but the language is strong enough that it'll be hard for future leaders to publicly reverse it and say that, the doors are closed. But there's no clear path, it seems, at least anytime soon, for Ukraine becoming part of NATO, and will probably be kicked down the road. So it'll probably be left to Ukraine at some point to realize that it's going to be in the waiting room forever, and to maybe decide that it's not going to pursue NATO membership, perhaps as part of some kind of peace settlement ending the war. But I would think what's unfortunate about it is because it was really so much focus on those two issues, is that, other things kind of missed, I think, in the public domain, which is the most important, I think, and it was a bit of a surprise, is how strong the statements were regarding China. The communique was actually pretty assertive in how it depicted China, calling it a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine, and calling on China to cease all material and political support to Russia's war effort. And, there's an implicit threat there that if China doesn't stop this support, it's going to come at some cost, though it doesn't say exactly what those costs might be. But I think it's really noticeable that the communique took this sort of sharper approach, particularly compared to last year's communique. It has the same language about saying that there should also be open to constructive engagement with the PRC. That's in both communiques, but it's much more buried in this year's communique. And so, I think the summit in some respects took what was an already tense situation with China and may have actually made it worse. And we can see that in how China has responded to the summit communique and sort of calling out NATO and saying it has malicious intent and all of these kinds of things. And there's no evidence that these statements really amount to anything more than posturing. So I think that's quite unfortunate. And I'll just finally say that at the end of the day, it seems to me that the most important stuff was actually not really discussed all that much at the summit. And that's really European defense. The communique, talks about enhancing NATO's deterrence and defense, particularly in the East. And it says, uses words like accelerating, efforts. We're conducting more frequent exercises, strengthening an ability to move and reinforce and supply, sustain our forces. But it's all pretty vague. And particularly when you can compare it to some of the things that were offered to Ukraine. It's very specific in saying a minimum of baseline funding of 40 billion euros within the next year for Ukraine will be offered by the alliance. But it's not the intermediate steps of how we're getting to strengthening our ability to move forces is not laid out. And even more than that, I would say, is that there's really no clear plan outline for building a stronger European pillar within NATO. I was really disappointed to see that there wasn't anything sort of talking about how we're really going to burden share or what really needs to be burden shifting for Europe to take over more of the defense responsibility. It's sort of very much lacking in the details and doesn't really even acknowledge a need for that to happen. And I think that's really unfortunate because it's not only a missed opportunity, but it's another year in which that discussion is not at the forefront of what the summit is about, and making that vision and really thinking about, in particular, how to create bridges to the European Union to help build and strengthen that European pillar in NATO. So that, to me, is a real disappointment in terms of the outcome of the summit.
Thanks, Kelly. Stephen, you're up.
Well, terrific, and I'm really grateful to Defense Priorities for hosting this conversation about the NATO summit, where I have to say, not very exciting takeaway, but not that much of significance appears to have happened. Maybe in hindsight, we'll look back and we'll say that actually the summit was something of a turning point, but I doubt it. NATO leaves the summit much as it was coming in to the summit. I agree with Kelly on basically everything she says. The only genuine surprise, perhaps, was the harsh condemnation in the communique of China's support for Russia's defense industry and the warning that it gave to Beijing. But, I think overall it was a missed opportunity. Everybody knows in the alliance that the alliance has major problems that it needs to address in the short term and the long term to make the alliance work, to make the transatlantic relationship work, and to get the alliance back to the business of deterrence and defense, its core function, and not to take away from that by trying to keep enlarging the alliance or pursuing out of area missions. But there is no consensus, I have to say, about whether to truly have a laser focus on deterrence and defense, even though, of course, people now want to do that. So we really didn't see an open discussion of growing the European pillar in NATO and preparing for the likelihood that the United States is going to retrench from Europe. It's going to diminish to some degree its commitment to European security over the next decade. And I think that's regardless of who is elected in November in the United States. This is about structural reasons. The United States has resource constraints. It clearly prioritizes its needs at home and its security imperatives in Asia over security in Europe. And the nature of the threat that Russia poses conventionally to Europe is a really difficult one for the United States to manage. It is the anti-Goldilocks threat because it's very costly for the United States to be, risking war with Russia over countries on Russia's borders, while at the same time, Russia is in no position to become a European hegemon and thereby imperil the kind of interests that the United States mobilized in World War II and during the Cold War to defend. Let me just finally say a little bit about what happened with respect to Ukraine. I think we got, in the end, more convoluted language on Ukraine's membership prospects than ever. I would kind of characterize the outcome of the communique as Bucharest plus or minus. It's in the eye of the beholder whether Ukraine is getting a greater commitment to one day bring it in than it's gotten for many, many years, going back to the Bucharest summit in 2008, where the alliance said that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. They've intended to give the impression both that it's getting stronger and that there are real conditions that have to be met that aren't met. And of course, that obviously allies have to agree for Ukraine to be joining. So the word irreversible was used, but what was irreversible was negotiated over down to the last minute. And what is irreversible, according to the communique, is Ukraine's, quote, path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership. So it doesn't say it's irreversible that Ukraine will join NATO. There's some other words in there that suggest perhaps one could later say that Ukraine has achieved Euro-Atlantic integration and that could be done potentially without NATO membership. So nevertheless, although it's almost impossible to say whether Ukraine is moving closer to NATO membership or not, there was no need to give these kind of signals both to Russia and to Ukraine. It's hard to see how it's productive. The fact is that the alliance is in no position to invite Ukraine to join the alliance, and rightly so. It could simply put the whole issue on ice rather than trying to suggest that it's very serious about bringing Ukraine in, which I'm afraid gives false hope to Ukrainians and gives them the impression that they cannot be secure without this gold standard of NATO membership that's very unlikely to happen for them, while at the same time, it gives Russia incentives to continue its war beyond the point where potentially Russia might want to stop to forestall the day when Ukraine might one day become a member of NATO.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Will, over to you.
Sure. Yeah. The danger, of course, of batting cleanup is that when you have two smart people like Kelly and Stephen, that they've said a lot of the great stuff already. And that's certainly the case. And I largely agree with them. And so I'll kind of try to add a few things, which is I'm a little bit more pessimistic, I guess, on the whole, even though I wouldn't contest anything that was said previously. My worry is about, what you might call kind of creeping NATO, which is that there are these baby steps that are taken And while so many foreign policy observers, particularly the ones that are so enthusiastic about Ukraine, will say, well, of course, this isn't happening anytime soon. But there is this kind of movement slowly with baby steps. So one thing is, yes, this kind of, it's a irreversible towards a path, right? But and that's very carefully worded, as Stephen talked about. But again, there is this notion of an inevitability that I think that you often, I think see through these things. And it's really a matter of whether events will proceed in a way that allows for the pro-Ukrainians in NATO to actually take that step when there's an opportunity. And the question is will there ever be that step? Will Russia actually, because of the fact that the enemy gets a vote here, will they take steps to forestall that actually could be actually worse for Ukraine? And that's been one of my concerns all along, is that well-intentioned actions on the part of the West could actually be problematic for Ukraine and lead this war to end much later than sooner, and potentially creating even more headaches down the road. I mean, one thing that I think that should be very wary of is kind of continuing efforts at interoperability, continuing efforts at greater military-to-military relationships that, again, will be seen by Russia, but also will give this air of inevitability for those of us like myself who would like to see NATO close that open door. I would like to see, fewer of these types of baby steps or creeping actions, if you will. One of the things that you've seen an attempt or talk about kind of Trump-proofing these movements, Trump-proofing the alliance. I think these are, for one, they're anti-democratic in the sense that they're actually trying to make sure that an institution cannot be changed by the most important member of that institution and by a potential president, if he should win, who would win with the support of the American people, or at least the majority of the American people in our democratic system. I think that is, certainly something you could imagine institutions wanting to try to do, particularly when there seems to be so many foreign nations that would be opposed to a move in this direction. But I just don't think you're going to be able to do that. I think it's a false hope, if you will, for those who would like to Trump-proof an alliance, because of the fact that the United States is simply the most important member. It's not an alliance of equals. It never has been. It's unlikely to be in the future. And if the president of the United States wants to go in a different direction when it comes to this alliance, I don't think that institution is going to be able to create the conditions that would actually box that president in, assuming that the president wanted to take the bandwidth and the political capital to change the status quo. And so I would anticipate that, we talked about how earlier about how in some ways this is kicking the can down the road. The fact is that I think a lot of people are just going to be waiting to see who wins. Is it someone like President Biden, who thinks of NATO as a sacred commitment? Someone like Trump, who is more of, I think, a realist about this in terms of seeing alliances as means to ends. And the question is whether the cost-benefit analysis is such that it would make sense to continue with the status quo or to try to change the relationship in one way or another. So I'll stop there. We'll have a good discussion going forward.
Thanks, Will. I want to pick up on a point you made there, which is that while it seems as though the alliance kind of continues to have this rhetoric about having an open door for membership and that Ukraine will join in the future, I have had this sense of late that, and I say this as a kind of hardcore structuralist, that even though there are more external constraints acting on the United States than there were 20 years ago, those constraints don't seem to be translating very gracefully into policy changes or adaptations. And so I guess my question would be, why is it that the open door is not being closed, especially as a condition for securing some kind of a peace in Ukraine, if the alliance and especially the United States really doesn't intend to bring in Ukraine at some point in the future? I feel as though there have been a lot of American foreign policy decisions that have not been made according to kind of hard national interests, and a lot of commitments have been made that have not been particularly prudent. And so, potentially in the future, why should Ukraine be any different? So I'm going to turn that over to Kelly to riff on, and then to the rest of you to jump in as you like.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a fair question, especially this issue of constraints, because I will admit that watching the summit this week, I was just really struck by how many issues were being discussed at a time when we're supposed to be focused back on European deterrence and defense. I mean, I was shocked to see NATO's opening a liaison office in Jordan. What? And so there wasn't a lot of sense to me that really European deterrence defense was really the top priority. I mean, they say it, but then there's so much else going on that you kind of wonder if it really is. But to get to your question about the open door, I mean, I think there's two things here going on. One is that for NATO to say that the open door, to be public about it and say the door is closed, or to really say publicly, we're not going to be offering Ukraine membership in NATO. That has to have consensus within the alliance as well. As much as it has to have consensus in the alliance about offering NATO membership, this is a consensus-based organization. To get a statement like that, you can imagine countries in Eastern Europe right now would veto it. They would not want NATO releasing that kind of statement. So I think that's one issue. And then I think the second issue is that, there is an argument to be made that thinking about negotiations, that it's a potential piece of leverage that NATO and Ukraine have, which is in negotiations to end the war, that's going to be clearly one of the things that will be negotiated, will be the future of NATO, of Ukraine and its relationship with NATO and the European Union. And I think there's probably hesitancy on the part of many leaders to have that discussion now before you're actively engaged in negotiations. So I think those are the two things that are holding back. And I'll just finally say very quickly that I think one of the things, particularly thinking about Eastern European countries and their enthusiasm for Ukrainian membership in NATO, it makes sense they want to push, the front lines away from their own borders. But because we're not actually having really honest discussions about European deterrence and defense, it has a way of almost making the primary threat seem like it is Ukraine, and that should be the focus, and not actually the reality of how are we actually deterring and defending existing NATO commitments. And so I think that's actually feeding into some of their enthusiasm for bringing Ukraine in. If you were really handing them the cold hard reality of, what is our plan to actually deter and defend you? I think that might actually change some of their enthusiasm, but we're not having those kinds of conversations.
Will, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. I mean, I think that Kelly's right about the leverage issue. And, you hear this all the time, people who are critical of say, the restrainer arguments about closing the open door. Well, why give it away? We should, have this available for a negotiation. And that's true about official Washington. But for those of us who are policy analysts, I think we should be making the case for why closing the open door is a good idea for American and Western security. And I think that's what we're aiming to do here, right? Ukraine is a liability for NATO, not a security benefit. It is much more likely to drag the United States, for example, into a conflict than it is to be supportive of the defense of Western Europe and the United States. And so I think that, again, I understand why they might not want to talk about it in an official communique, but I think it is important, for example, for those of us who think this is the right policy approach, for us to do so and make that case, particularly because I think it has to be inside the Overton window. People need to realize that there are important analysts who understand the realities and hardcore nature of international politics who think that this is a real option and ought to be on the table, not just for American security, but potentially as a way to find a peaceful solution to a horrific war in Ukraine. And so I'm not going to stop talking about this, even though those who don't either like that or want to make sure that it's part of leverage would choose not to bring that to the fore. I think we ought to be bringing that to the fore. And one thing I'd also highlight is that Stephen and I put together a letter that was in Politico or reported on in Politico, talking about the importance of not taking further steps. And so I think it's an interesting question whether they listened at all. But the fact is that that step of really putting NATO's future when it comes to Ukraine on the table in these negotiations would be a positive move from my perspective, and not a negative.
Stephen?
Yeah, look, I don't expect the professions that NATO would like to one day bring in Ukraine to stop until the war stops for the leverage reason. But is what's going on here an attempt to use leverage in a negotiation? You don't need to keep talking up, this time we're really serious, aren't we? And then, by the way, there are conditions and allies have to agree. To get the leverage, you could just repeat the prior statements that NATO has made since 2008. So they could put the issue on ice. That's not what we're seeing. In addition, to use the issue as leverage, one has to have a realistic theory of an endgame in Ukraine. And I don't see another realistic theory right now, except one that involves negotiations. And the White House itself says, although not very vocally these days, that it expects the war to be ended through negotiations with Russia. But negotiations have become stigmatized. And there was really no substantial discussion in the NATO summit of what a realistic endgame for the war is. Just promises to do more to help Ukraine. So it's not clear to me that what we are seeing is actually a determined effort to use leverage to obtain other benefits in an eventual negotiation. But I think the more difficult question here about why the open door to Ukraine wasn't closed, looks at the pre-war, pre-February 2022 time, when there wasn't a war where you could make the argument that the open door should be dangled to obtain leverage. There was a war in the east of Ukraine, but that wasn't the same kind of concern that we have now. And so this goes back to a project of NATO enlargement dating to the 1990s, in which NATO reinvented the open door to become a much more active, endlessly expansive process where NATO would hold the door open. And actually, the Washington Treaty, when you read the language that is used to sort of claim that the open door policy derives from the treaty puts the onus on the allies to extend an invitation. It doesn't say anything about the alliance needing to constantly talk up its potential willingness to extend membership to new countries. So I think there has been a shift, and people are very committed in Washington and in some other allied capitals, though not all, to maintaining that open door policy and avoiding the suggestion that it's an irresponsible policy that serves to provoke Russia without providing security to the countries in question. And so they're very defensive about it. And what was, I think, really striking in the lead up to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was that the United States appeared to be most reluctant to make concessions on this issue of the open door to Ukraine, even as it didn't seem as though the Biden administration really wanted to see Ukraine join NATO in any kind of foreseeable future. So I think this is really troubling. And so what I worry about right now in the discussions of the potential that Ukraine could join NATO is we're seeing the return, ironically, of League of Nations thinking via the vehicle of NATO. People are talking about the need for Ukraine to one day join NATO, while seeming to assume that the mere inclusion of the word Ukraine on an amended Washington Treaty would be enough to provide deterrence. That is actually not even how the architects of NATO thought. We're back to the wishful thinking of the League of Nations era. And what I worry about, just to put a button on Will's concern about creeping NATO enlargement to Ukraine, is that potentially years from now, as part of an overall settlement of the war in Ukraine, NATO may actually take that step of offering membership, or there could be a security guarantee of a similar nature to the Article 5 guarantee of NATO. And then, even though we hadn't had a proper debate about this issue, because it supposedly wasn't a real issue and it was just words on the communiques, et cetera, it'll be pretty hard to have a serious debate if the end of the war is wrapped up in Ukraine getting that kind of security guarantee, because then essentially, if you're against that guarantee, you're implicitly for the war continuing.
Yeah, and I wanted to add just one more thing about the process here of taking it off the table, and obviously Kelly is right about the official details, but one thing that you could imagine happening, especially if this turns into a frozen conflict where it doesn't look like it's actually going to end one way or another anytime soon, is you could see some countries unilaterally or in conjunction with each other essentially saying unofficially, but essentially signaling where things are actually going to be, that they are not interested in accepting new members. I mean, and this goes to the kind of Trump proofing. I mean, whether it's President Trump or some other president in the future, they could simply essentially announce that they're not interested in this. And the United States' voice is certainly going to be more important than North Macedonia's when it comes to that. So if it was the United States, that would be really quite meaningful. But you could also imagine other countries, say a Hungary or a Slovakia or someone, making similar suggestions. And so you wouldn't necessarily have to have a communique. It would essentially create a kind of check on a creeping NATO.
Yeah, I'd love to just comment briefly on something Stephen said, because I think it's really important, this sort of League of Nations thinking, and I like how he phrased that. You know, I think one of the problems I see is that in the 90s into 2000s, when we engaged in NATO expansion, we tried to do it almost on the cheap. It's as though we put it on the credit card and we hoped we didn't have to really pay the bill. Because there wasn't discussion about what it meant in the sense of what Article 5 commitments really mean at the end of the day, which means that we are prepared to go to war to defend that country, potentially escalating to a nuclear level. And that's a really serious commitment to be making. And so because the security environment was different, we didn't see Russia as a threat, we didn't really have that conversation about, well, are we willing to do that for certain countries that were coming into the alliance? But I would like to think that the one thing Ukraine war has done is sobered people up to the fact that that Article 5 commitment is quite serious, and particularly the nuclear war issue. And, the letter, that Will and Stephen have talked about, and then I also signed, talks about the credibility concerns around offering guarantees to Ukraine, because we haven't been willing to go to direct war over Russia over Ukraine. But putting that aside for a second, what I would just say is, people like to make the argument, well, we brought in Baltic states and that provided security. See, for them, as though it was like magic. And again, this is going back to the credit card idea. That's not a good comparison to what Ukraine's situation would be coming into NATO, because it's actually a lot more like, in many respects, more like Western Germany, in the sense that the lines are not going to be very clear, even after a peace settlement. There may be some degree of dispute about what the rules of the road are not going to be clear. We'd essentially be going back, I think, to a really dangerous time, something more like the 1950s in Europe, when we saw most of the Cold War crises occurred in the 1950s. When the rules of the road were not clear and the Russians were probing and there were these incidents. And so taking Ukraine into NATO is not just the fact that you're going to have to come up with an actual military plan, and I'm waiting to hear what that is, to defend and deter Russia, but it's going to be directly challenged in ways that are very, very dangerous. And that's part of the discussion that's not been happening, is exactly that, of what that means and why that would be in NATO's strategic interest. Because if NATO doesn't assert and respond forcefully to those probes, it then starts to call in question the entire credibility of all those commitments, including the ones in the Baltics, and could actually be its actual undoing.
It's so striking that people who seem to be so enthusiastic about the NATO alliance, including a US-led NATO alliance, are promoting an idea that is maybe the main way that NATO could collapse, making a non-credible commitment to Ukraine, a country that Russia will have recently invaded at best, in which the NATO allies declined to go directly to Ukraine's defense. If Moscow decides that that is not a credible commitment, it gets an opportunity to shatter the entire alliance by testing it and showing that only some countries, if any, in fact do uphold Article 5's widespread interpretation of requiring the alliance to go to war to defend any member. And so that is deeply concerning, even though I agree, Kelly, you would have thought that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine would have clarified minds as to the serious nature of these commitments, and the need to get back to the basics of deterrence and defense of NATO territory. One note on the West German model, which is frequently discussed for Ukraine. When West Germany came into NATO in the middle of the 1950s, it didn't, as a legal matter, renounce its rights to the rest of German territory, but it did renounce a right to actively seek to reunify Germany. So if you follow the model, then Ukraine would have to acknowledge its view that in the fullness of time, it hopes that Ukraine becomes whole again, but in fact, it will not take actions to bring that about. That is something that doesn't seem to have a whole lot of support right now in the discussion. But more important than that, the United States and other NATO allies station hundreds of thousands of troops on the West German border and tactical nuclear weapons to make this commitment credible. And still people wondered throughout the Cold War, would the United States really take that risk for territory that was clearly of great strategic importance and for which the United States had fought in the Second World War? The conditions are so different in Ukraine that it kind of boggles the mind how to make the West German model work for Ukraine, for a divided Ukraine. How would you make that credible? And at the end of the day, you just can't really convince anyone that Ukraine has the same kind of strategic significance as West Germany did. So I think those are fundamental obstacles with the West German model.
Yeah, and one thing I would add too is that we shouldn't skip over the fact that the Baltic expansion of NATO was a mistake. This was not something that was useful for the United States and many of our Western allies. It was certainly useful for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in some sense. But look, this is still a wicked problem. defending the Baltics is a really big challenge if it were tested. And we shouldn't escape that. And that goes back to what Kelly said at the beginning about a failure of NATO to be actually considering the challenges of defense and deterrence. There's so much focus on Ukraine, a country that is not a member. It is not a member. It is not a member. And we're told by many that, well, don't worry, it's not going to be a member. Well, why are we spending so much time on it? Especially because, and Stephen's pointed this out before, it's been very clear that the administration has not considered Ukraine's security to be so fundamental to the West that it's willing to fight a war for. We've already told the world that. Now we've spent tens and hundreds of billions of dollars on Ukraine, but we've never signaled that it's so important that we would defend it in the face of a collapse of the Ukrainian lines. Now, I do worry that we would somehow fall into that pattern and get into the conflict. I do worry about that. And that's one of the reasons why I think that we should be pushing again to end this war sooner, even if that means closing officially the open door and finding some type of solution based on something in history like Finland or Austria or West German model, or something entirely different that would be unique to the situation. The other thing I wanted to mention, maybe this could be a pivot to some other issues, is I don't think that you were very happy if you were the country of Georgia, which, remember, back at Bucharest was much more on par, you might say, with Ukraine. We did not see that here. And if I were to take some optimism out of this summit as a restrainer, that would be the one. I would not be that optimistic if I was in Georgia.
I just want to underline something that you've all been talking about, just because you encounter a very common argument all the time, this idea that a kind of paper commitment is itself the kind of ultimate deterrent, and we seem to have lost this wisdom from the Cold War that we actually felt it was very difficult to convince the Soviet Union that we would be willing to risk nuclear war, even to deny them the ability to conquer and potentially harness the power of the major industrial centers of Western Europe. And so it's just, as you were saying, Stephen, it's a kind of mind-bogglingly different situation. I do want to move away from Europe and talk about, in the 1990s, there was this famous saying that the future of NATO was either out of area or out of business. And, Kelly, you brought up this situation with Oman, and it seems like we're now moving extremely out of area. There's all this talk about NATO's potential role in the Indo-Pacific, even though obviously the Europeans are not even really serious about European security. And Kelly, you wrote this excellent article in Foreign Affairs co-wrote this excellent article in Foreign Affairs about why they shouldn't do that. So I'd love if you want to riff on that for a bit.
Sure. Well, thank you. Yeah. So, this was one of the interesting parts of the summit for me, was sort of the fact that they actually chose to make this one of the core themes of the summit, was building the partnerships with the Indo-Pacific. And so I think that is a noticeable choice. And I'll just say three things about this. One is NATO is playing, I think, a very dangerous game right now, and that it keeps reiterating, we have no plans to move into the Indo-Pacific. We're not going to have a military presence there. Okay, let's take that at face value. And, there are reasons I love this expression, creeping NATO, because that's sort of, I think what you worry about in the Indo-Pacific, but let's take it at face value, and that there wouldn't be large, military presence under the NATO flag there. Well, then what exactly is going on? Because NATO is a military alliance. And so what it has to bring to any region, including the Indo-Pacific, would be military capabilities. So what exactly is the purpose of deepening this cooperation? It seems as though it's largely to try to connect these regions in a way that the Biden administration advances this idea that security in Europe and security in Asia is interconnected, trying to link up its democratic allies in both regions. That seems to be what this is largely about. And so they've identified these areas like cybersecurity and disinformation as areas where they face common challenges. Well, two things about that. One, those are all things that actually the European Union does, those areas of cooperation, in fact, has real expertise. And there's bureaucratic disputes about who should have primary, NATO or the European Union, even within European security on those issues. And the second thing is, I'd say, according to that logic, like, well, we all face cyber attacks. We all have disinformation problems. Well, by that logic, everyone also has airborne threats around the world. So does that mean everyone's security is interconnected because we all face missile threats? Again, we're building these connections that I don't think actually are strategically all that sound. But what we're doing in the process is certainly raising tensions with China as a result. Yes, NATO is a defensive alliance, and we say that over and over again. But from China's perspective, it has observed NATO expansion in Europe. And it is concerned, regardless of what we say, that our intention is to ultimately expand NATO into the Indo-Pacific, that this is the beginning of that with the IP4. And also they have longstanding concerns about encirclement. And so we're sort of feeding that paranoia. And so if we're feeding the paranoia, but we're not actually bringing additional deterrence capabilities, we're creating the perfect storm, the worst of both worlds. And so I think this really needs to be rethought. And I'll just finally say, it goes back to, I think, even more at something that was said over and over and over again at this summit, which is that the security of the two regions is interconnected. And I would just challenge that notion that it is interconnected. I don't think that's correct. I think there are two fronts for the United States. And it is true that Russia can be an Asian power, but I don't think it's as interconnected as NATO leaders and certainly the United States is trying to say. This is actually not any different than what happened during the Cold War. I'd like to see, if they're going to make that argument, then really lay it out while these are interconnected and in ways that require cooperation. Otherwise, I think that's a tenuous link, and it's leading us down a path that's actually not strategically wise, and we need to really rethink it.
Yeah, if I could just jump in. I mean, I think it is true on a factual level that security challenges have interconnections across regions, but it doesn't follow that the solution is to keep the United States as the central security provider everywhere, while exhorting allies and partners to help everywhere. The problem really is that the United States is seriously overstretched and overcommitted. And at a basic level, there's only one solution to this problem, and that is to renegotiate the transatlantic bargain. The United States moves to a supporting role in European security, while Europeans move to the leading role in defending themselves. That frees up the United States to attend to its domestic needs and to prioritize security in the Indo-Pacific. And anything short of that is this kind of, I'm afraid, functions as an attempt to make everyone's eyes roll to the back of their head to say, oh, we're getting some stuff from here, we're getting some stuff from there. Look at all these nice symbolic gestures. We're opening a NATO office in Tokyo, etc. So it looks like we're getting a whole lot of meaningful burden sharing, but the burdens on the United States are not reducing at all. In fact, they're increasing because the potential for conflict in each of these places is increasing, and the United States isn't stepping back anywhere at all. So this Biden administration attempt to tout connective tissue as its kind of solution to the problem of overstretch is, I think, fundamentally incorrect.
Yeah, and at the same time, we're still maintaining commitments and even talking about expanding commitments in the Middle East. So in a way, you could argue that there was a kind of tide of restraint options and even a withdrawal from Afghanistan under President Trump, and then fulfilled under President Biden. And then the empire strikes back, so to speak, in terms of the primacists, whereby there's still this idea that the United States is going to have globe-girdling alliances, globe-girdling commitments. This notion of connective tissue is not really the right analogy. It's more that the United States is connected to these ways that are actually more like the strings that held Gulliver down. And that's, I think a real error here. And what Stephen has talked about in terms of, whether you want to call it the pivot to Asia or prioritizing the, dealing with the rise of China, that means that there has to be, if it's going to be sensible and realistic, given the fact that, yes, even the United States has to prioritize and has limited scarce resources, we're going to have to do something when it comes to Europe and the Middle East other than what we are. And let's not forget, we're $34.5 trillion in debt. And we're talking about continuing to fund, essentially $1 trillion defense budget, and adding new commitments that could include fighting wars that themselves could be, quite expensive. I mean, I just don't know where ultimately it comes from. And so you could have this situation where, we face, continuing challenges on the economic front. What would happen if you had a greater, faster move towards de-dollarization, for example, and what that could mean. I just don't like the future ahead if we're not willing to make adult choices when it comes to priorities, which is why defense priorities is so aptly named.
I'd like to. I've now given you about less than 3 minutes each to make some policy recommendations and solve the world's problems for us. But I would like to end with some takeaways. Will, you had said before that maybe we won't even say Trump proofing, but the America proofing of the alliance has not taken form yet. So what, how could the burden for European security be shifted more to the Europeans themselves?
I mean, look, this has been the $64,000 question for a long time when it comes to NATO burden sharing and burden shifting. I mean, because on the one hand, you have American officials throughout the Cold War talked about trying to promote this, but on the other hand, when Europe made steps in that direction, there were primacists who wanted to constrain Europe's ability to act autonomously, and then we're in a situation right now where you could argue that states like Germany are actually being, kind of practicing a higher realism by podcasting and free riding on the United States because of the fact that we're allowing them to do this. And we don't have a lot of credible threats as long as we talk about NATO being a sacred commitment or a sacred obligation. I mean, if it's a religious duty of ours, why would someone step up to the plate? This is kind of a classic example of the economic concept of moral hazard. So I think that actually there are going to have to be, some steps that are taken where there are real threats if we don't see changes by our allies and partners. And in particular, Germany, right? Germany is the most important state when it comes to kind of the opportunities and challenges of European burden shifting and burden sharing. And so we need to be, I think, much firmer. And in that sense, I think a President Trump would actually be quite beneficial because he has not made NATO or our European allies a sacred, kind of totem, right? And there's a much more credible, I think, threat to change the status quo. I don't see how anybody could buy President Biden, given how he's approached NATO. And again, not just individuals. I'm just talking about administrations, right? When you elect a president, you're electing a team. And this team is filled with committed transatlanticists, committed primacists, And I think that means that why would Europe think it had to change?
Stephen, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, I have noticed a good deal of rethinking in European capitals over the past 12, 18 months. And it's pretty obvious what's triggered that. It has been the reality that very well Donald Trump might become president again. So there are now high-level discussions. Look at what's coming out, for example, of the European Council on Foreign Relations that are echoing a lot of points that a number of us here have been making for many years. And I think what this reflects is a recognition that it may actually be in Europe's interest to stop the free riding, to do less cheap riding, and to take on the lion's share of the burden of defending Europe. I can see the argument Will was alluding to, that it was a kind of higher form of realism for European states to free and cheap ride in the last several decades. But now that might not be the case, especially because of the nature of Russia's threat. It's a more unpredictable and aggrieved country. And it does threaten the European project, which has developed over the past several decades into something that a lot of Europeans care about, although it's, of course, politically contested as well. So I think there's a lot of discussion now about how, not just whether, Europe should step up. I think that starts with providing combat-capable manpower, improving the readiness and sustainability of European forces. It means acquiring capabilities for high-intensity operations that the United States currently heavily provides. It means more funding, yes, and by the way, I will note that the EU can issue bonds now. But it also means, perhaps especially given that NATO and EU-Europe already significantly outspends Russia on defense, it means working together, more joint procurement and production, and building Europe's defense industrial base. And that in turn means the United States actually needs to make a concerted effort to get out of the way. I'm concerned that the next administration, whatever it is, might see it as a win for the United States to keep the heavy doses of arms sales going to Europe, when what Europe needs to do is develop its own production and become more self-sufficient. And I think we have to be honest that a less dependent Europe is going to be a more independent Europe. And that means Europe might acquire some space to go its own way on certain issues, such as economic relations with China. I do think that's probably part of the trade-off here. I don't think Europe is going to bandwagon with China or Russia. I don't see that happening. But I think we do have to accept, the United States will have potentially less leverage in those areas than it's had before, but it is absolutely worth it to solve the acute problem of overstretch and overcommitment that the United States faces.
Kelly, you're closing us out.
Yeah, so, I think all of what Will and Stephen said is all really smart ideas, spending more, spending better. I will say, though, I'm not as optimistic as Stephen about Europe stepping up. Because what I saw was that after the invasion happened in February 2022, the threat assessment got much higher in Europe, and there was sort of this activism of like, wow, we've got to really get this together. And what I saw over time is that as it was clear that Russia was not actually going to succeed in capturing all of Ukraine, is it seemed like, especially in Western Europe, that threat assessment started coming back down. And so, yes, they're doing things, but it's not being done with the level of urgency that I would expect if you were really concerned about the Russian threat and about the U.S. doing less. And so I think they're trying to do enough. They're doing what I think they usually do, which is trying to do enough to satisfy our demands for some burden sharing, but not more than maybe is required. And so, they're spending more, spending 2%. Okay. But the countries that we really need to be spending a lot more are not, which is France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the countries that would really make the big difference. And so that, and then they're not spending well. And so, Stephen brought this up about the joint procurement, but it's also some of the decisions they've made about how to use their money. In Germany, it spent most of its budget increase on F-35s. That's not a smart decision. You only do that because you're able to cheap ride off the United States. You buy a high prestige item like that. And I say this, the third thing is what we really need is a plan, concrete plan with benchmarks. And I think the timeline really needs to be aggressive on this about over the next 10 years. Nope. I think it needs to be over 5 years. What is the plan for the United States to be drawing down forces and Europe's plan to be able to take over those responsibilities and commitments? And coinciding with that, because if we are going to be doing less, we should also have less of a leadership role. It's only fair that Europeans be able to step up and take those leadership positions and have voice. There should also be a plan for transitioning things like Supreme Allied Commander from always being an American to also being a European. And so, but I think we need a really aggressive 5-year plan. And part of the answer to that plan is also institutionalizing connections with the European Union, because that's the only way we're going to get a stronger European pillar in NATO, is actually taking advantage of the European Union.
And on that note, I'm glad that unlike NATO and European security, this conversation did not have a hub and spoke model, and that you all made so many. I was worried that this might be a lackluster topic to some extent, but you all ended up having so many great points, and this was such a great conversation. I wish I could go on for another hour. So I want to thank all of you and thank Defense Priorities and all of you who watched, and take care.
Thanks so much. This was fun.